When I talk to folks, maybe when I'm first getting a chance to meet them, one of the questions that I like to ask is, did you grow up in this area? I just enjoy hearing people's stories, and sometimes the answer is yes, they grew up in this area, in the small community, or in this region. Maybe they moved across town, or maybe just across the road, or they've kind of lived on the same plot of land their whole life. Other times, people's answers, well, no, they didn't grow up in this area, and there was some moving there, maybe across the country or the next state over. If I could ask you that question, how many times have you moved in your life? What would your answer be? Have you stopped and ever thought that through, the actual number? My wife, Carrie, and I, we've been married for 21 years. And we have moved, what I would guess is more than whatever the average number is. I didn't try to look it up. I don't have any scientific numbers here, but I would venture to say we've moved more than the average couple. We've moved 11 times. That's how many different houses and places we've lived in. We've lived in 4 different states. When we were first married, we lived in Ohio, then we moved to New York, then Georgia, then Kentucky. Now we're back here to New York. And now, when we move, there's always physical work involved, right? You got to pack the boxes, load the boxes, unload the boxes, etc. If you've moved, you know what I'm talking about. And sometimes the moves, though, they were fairly easy. By that I mean like we were just moving across the road or maybe across town, something like that. But sometimes, in those moves that Carrie and I did, they were a lot harder emotionally and mentally. 7 different times we actually changed locations, whether to a different state or a different city. Now, when we moved, I don't know the circumstances behind yours, but when we moved, it was always job related. But our family, Carrie and I, our kids, we were stable. And that was a blessing because, there's a lot that goes into a move. Right? If you've ever done that, especially if you've just totally changed areas, you've got to explore a new community. You've got to find a new church. We've had to do that several different times. I have a lot of stories I could tell about that. You've got to say goodbye to old friends that you're not sure you'll ever see again. Of course, now you got to work on making some new friends. We're kicking off a new series that I've called The Gospel According to Ruth. And as we start out by reading the book of Ruth, this story starts with a move. Let me start reading in Ruth Chapter 1, the first 5 verses. Here's what it says. During the time of the judges, there was a famine in the land. A man left Bethlehem in Judah with his wife and 2 sons to stay in the territory of Moab for a while. The man's name was Elimelech, and his wife's name was Naomi. The names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They entered the fields of Moab and settled there. Naomi's husband, Elimelech, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. Her sons took Moabite women as their wives. One was named Orpah, and the second was named Ruth. After they lived in Moab about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died. And the woman was left without her 2 children and without her husband. Now in Scripture, the book of Ruth follows the book of Judges. It comes right after it. And we read the introduction for the rest of this story in the book of Ruth in these first 5 verses. We learn the place, we learn the time, we are introduced to some of the characters. And while it'd be really easy to just gloss over these first 5 verses to kind of get into the whole rest of the story, I don't want us to miss what we just read. The heartache and the catastrophic events wrapped up in these first 5 verses, specifically for Naomi and what she's going through in what we just read. What are some of the catastrophic events? What is Naomi's heartache here that she is experiencing? Well, first we read about the famine, right? There's no food. And maybe you're a mom and you can relate to this idea that you'll do anything for your family, for your boys, and to be wondering where that next meal is going to come from, and what are we going to do, and I'll sacrifice even myself in order to get them their next meal. The pressure and the stress she must have been under to figure out, how am I going to feed my family? That's heartache number one. But we also read in these 5 verses that they had to move, right? I talked about that at the beginning. They decide to leave Israel and head to a foreign land. It might be unthinkable to a lot of people in that day and time, but desperate times call for desperate measures, and so they leave the promised land for a foreign country. But they didn't just go to any foreign land. They went to the land of Moab, it tells us. Now, here's what you need to know, because this is going to be important for the rest of the story. Israelites didn't have a favorable disposition towards the Moabites. There's at least 5 reasons why this was probably the case. Let me just run through them for you quickly. First, the Moabites' origins, right? Through the incestuous relationship of Lot and his daughter. You could read about that in Genesis chapter 19, but that's probably reason number 1. Reason number 2, the Moabites' resistance to Israelite passage through their territory when they came from Egypt. You read about that in the book of Numbers. Reason number 3, the Moabite women's seduction of the Israelites and the punishment that came with it for Israel. Reason number 4, Israel's exclusion of Moab from the Lord's assembly, and then finally oppression of the Israelites by Eglon, the king of Moab. Reason after reason why they would not have viewed the folks from Moab in a positive light, but that's where they went. They're desperately moving to a place they really probably didn't want to go, but they probably didn't feel they had much of a choice. And now they're the foreigners, they're the outsiders. And the heartache for Naomi to leave her friends, her comfort zone where she was, but she had to do it to feed her family. And the pressure that must have put on her, the famine, the move. And then third, heartache reaches a whole new level when her husband, Elimelech, dies. I mean, it's one thing to be going to a foreign land. It's one thing to be going on one of these moves. But at least you're together, right? Husband and wife, ready to stand by side and take on the world. But now Naomi doesn't even have that, doesn't even have her partner standing there beside her. While Scripture doesn't tell us how long they were in Moab, they were there long enough that the sons became old enough to get married. And so they did, and we're introduced to 2 characters, Orpah and Ruth. And I would like to think, and I'm maybe reading into it here just a little bit, that for Naomi to see her sons happy must have brought some sort of smile to this grieving widow's face, right? She at least still had some hope. At least her boys are there and they can try to help provide for her. But then we reach the 4th catastrophic event in just these first 5 verses for Naomi, and that is that her 2 sons died. And that leaves Naomi by herself. Her husband's died. Her sons have died. Now she's just got these 2 daughters-in-law who are themselves also now grieving. This scene that we just read in these first 5 verses, when someone is at their rock bottom, it sets the stage for the rest of the book. Naomi is there facing this famine, wondering where the next meal is going to come from. And she uproots her family and moves to a strange land. And she loses her husband and loses her 2 sons. Now what? As we read through the rest of this chapter and story, it's really important, I think, that we keep Naomi's frame of mind front and center. Think about how you would be feeling if you've walked where Naomi has walked. And maybe for some of you, you can relate to where she's at. But think about that as we read what comes next. Here's how the story continues in verse 6. She and her daughters-in-law set out to return from the territory of Moab, because she had heard in Moab that the Lord had paid attention to his people's need by providing them food. she left the place where she had been living, accompanied by her 2 daughters-in-law, and traveled along the road leading back to the land of Judah. Naomi said to them, "Each of you go back to your mother's home. May the Lord show kindness to you as you have shown to the dead and to me. May the Lord grant each of you rest in the house of a new husband." She kissed them, and they wept loudly. They said to her, "We insist on returning with you to your people." But Naomi replied, "Return home, my daughters. Why do you want to go with me? Am I able to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. Go on, for I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought that there was still hope for me to have a husband tonight and to bear sons, would you be willing to wait for them to grow up? Would you restrain yourselves from remarrying? No, my daughters, my life is much too bitter for you to share, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." And they wept loudly. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. Naomi said, "Look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Follow your sister-in-law." After this heart-wrenching introduction of 5 verses, we now get to the main part of this story, or at least the main part in chapter 1. Now, an interesting side note, you'll notice as we go through the book of Ruth that the dialogue is the main device used by the author to tell this story. There are 84 verses in the book of Ruth. 59 of them, or 70% of the verses in Ruth, contain dialogue. And in this conversation, in this dialogue, Naomi makes a couple of really important decisions. First, Naomi decides to return to Israel. Right? She's gotten word that the famine is over. So she's going to head back to her home. Second, she decides to tell her daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, to return back to their own home. She uses this phrase, "Go back to your mother's home." Like, listen, ladies, I appreciate what you've done, but I'm not your real mother. You have a mother back home. Go back to her. And this is a huge, just self-sacrificing request for Naomi. Remember, they've been family now. They have been together for at least 10 years. Scripture tells us, probably longer. We don't have an exact number. But for Naomi to say, "Go back," she's giving up just one more thing. But in this request that Naomi communicates to them or asks of them, she communicates, and we can learn just 2 really important things about this story. First, we learn about the kindness of Orpah and Ruth. Right, in verse 8, Naomi said, "May the Lord show kindness to you." That's the key word, kindness to you as you have shown to the dead and to me. This word kindness here, it's a very specific Hebrew word that's used a couple more places in the book of Ruth as well as throughout the Old Testament. And it speaks of a loving kindness. It speaks of God's covenant loyalty to his people. It involves grace in that it was extended even when it was not deserved. And Naomi was asking God to show loving kindness to the 2 women who had shown kindness to not only her now deceased sons, but to her. Orpah and Ruth were 2 kind people at the highest level. And the second thing that Naomi communicates in this request is she asks that God would give them each a new husband. Marriage, if you're familiar with the story of Ruth, it's going to become a key issue in this book. And in this culture, marriage meant security for a woman. Naomi implores them to be sure to go back and remarry. Because in this time, in this culture, a woman without a husband was in a serious situation because she lacked that security. The widows especially were needy and didn't have provisions that came with being in a marriage. And in this long request, you might have picked up on it, but Naomi refers to an ancient custom in Israel in which a brother was responsible to marry his deceased brother's wife in order to have a son and to continue on in the family line. And Naomi, thinking through that timeline, realizes that that would be impossible, right? She doesn't have any more sons. She's too old to have sons, but even if she could, would it really be feasible for the women to wait, another 18, 20 years, however long it would have taken to remarry? So Naomi says, head on back. Man, just the grief and the heartache in Naomi's heart. So Naomi gives a kiss that is intended as another way to say it would be just as a farewell hug. Have you ever had to say goodbye to somebody? Say goodbye to some friends, a loved one? Not sure that you'll ever see them again? I've had to do that. Maybe you have too. And there's nothing easy about that, is there? And if we could have just been a fly on the wall of that dialogue, watching that, the emotion that must have been there, and for Naomi to then say, head on back and give them a hug, knowing that I will probably not ever see you again. These women that have been a vital part of her son's life and her life. I can remember that when I've had to do things like that, when I've given hugs to people that meant a great deal to me. And you say, yeah, we'll try to stay in touch, and technology certainly makes that easier, but time goes on and life happens. Oh, those are hard times, aren't they? And we read in this passage that there's tremendous grief and angst from Orpah and Ruth over what their mother-in-law is asking them to do. Twice we're told that there is just loud weeping. And it's here where Orpah and Ruth split. Orpah makes a decision to return home. She returns the farewell kiss to Naomi and departs. Now, I don't think this is a decision that Orpah should be criticized for. She does what Naomi asks her to do. We could probably assume that she remarries in Moab. We don't know. She's not mentioned again in the book of Ruth. The emotional turmoil that's happened up to this point, to see one of your daughters-in-law do what you're asking them to do, but the heartache that's involved there and the grief. But then there's still Ruth. And Ruth makes a different decision. Here's what happens next in verse 16. But Ruth replied, don't plead with me to abandon you or to return and not follow you. For wherever you go, I will go. And wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord punish me and do so severely if anything but death separates you and me. When Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped talking to her. Not stop talking as in an angry kind of way. She just saw there was no point in trying to change her mind. She was set in her ways. Maybe you've come across somebody like that where it's not even worth talking about anymore. They've already made their mind up. But you know, in these verses that we've read, 4 different times in this conversation, Naomi encourages Ruth to go back home. 4 different times, Naomi tries to set Ruth up for success. You know, she's basically saying to her, go back to what you know. Go back to your mother. Go back to your gods. Find security. Find comfort there because you're not going to find it with me. But Ruth makes a pledge of commitment here that is so profound, so memorable. That even if you haven't heard the story of Ruth, if you're not familiar with this, you probably have heard this promise that we just quoted, right? Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. I have heard that in like a marriage ceremony or something like that. Maybe you have too. But Ruth chose Naomi, knowing that it probably would mean she would never get married as a Moabite foreigner in the nation of Israel. Remember how Israelites viewed the folks from Moab, knowing that it probably meant then that she would never have kids, knowing that it meant forsaking her own family back home, her own land. But Ruth chose Naomi even to the point of death. Where you die, I will die. Man, what commitment from Ruth. What faithfulness, what kindness, what loyalty, what sacrifice Ruth is showing here. And there's no changing her mind. So Naomi stops trying. Here's how chapter 1 concludes. The 2 of them traveled until they came to Bethlehem. When they entered Bethlehem, the whole town was excited about their arrival, and the local women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" "Don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara," she answered. For the Almighty has made me very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has opposed me and the Almighty has afflicted me? These two women return to the home of Naomi, or the land, and they picture this scene, right? Maybe they're just coming up over the horizon. Naomi's been gone maybe a dozen years. And when she left, she had a husband and two young boys. But now she returns with just one other woman, and a foreigner at that, a Moabite. And she's undergone tremendous grief and heartache and stress and change. So much so, the women of Bethlehem, they're not even sure who they're looking at. And Naomi just lays it out there. She gives the unvarnished truth to these women. She lays her soul out bare for the whole town to see. And she says, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara. Now the reason for this, the name Naomi meant sweetness, pleasantness. Whereas Mara, as Naomi tells us, means bitter. I went out sweet, pleasant. She must have lived up to her name before, right? This sweetness, this pleasantness, because the whole town was excited upon her return. But she has come back a changed person. You know, I was thinking about that. I don't know if you like chocolate. It's okay for me. I'll enjoy it. I don't know if you like it. But I've got this Hershey bar here, and I'm opening it up, and there's something about chocolate that's just pleasant, right? Most people that like it, it's pleasant, it's sweet, it's good. I just went with a real basic Hershey bar. My favorite is probably Snickers or peanut M&Ms. Those are, I think, my favorite two candies. It's pleasant, sweet. Now, what would be closely related to chocolate that's not pleasant and sweet? What about cocoa powder? I grabbed this from my house. Actually, my daughter found it for me. So thank you, Natalie. Baking cocoa. This stuff is bitter. You ever had this just straight with a spoon? I don't know if you have or not. We're just going to take a little bit right here. This isn't like hot cocoa powder, like you're going to make some hot chocolate. This isn't like this. Oh. That is worse than I imagined it would be. Woo! Excuse me. That's bitter. That is nasty stuff. How they do that, how they make cocoa powder is one of the ingredients to take that bitterness, and of course then they add some stuff to it to get chocolate. Wow, that's quite the contrast. Pleasant, sweetness, back to the chocolate, back to the cocoa. As soon as this is done, I'll probably have a little bit more of that chocolate to get that taste out of my mouth now. I thought about that just because of what Naomi says in this passage. I went away, sweetness, pleasantness, came back, bitter. She says that in verse 21, right? I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. And this statement really reveals the deep emotional anguish that Naomi is feeling. One commentator put it this way: Naomi had left Bethlehem because of a food famine, but she returned with a famine in her soul. This brings us almost to the end of chapter 1, the first of 4 chapters in the book of Ruth. And of the two primary characters that we've met so far, Naomi and Ruth, I don't know which one you resonate with more right now. Maybe at this point in time you resonate with Ruth. What do I mean by that? Well, maybe you've made a decision. It's going to cost you something. It's going to cost you a lot. Maybe you're just trying to be faithful to what you think God has led you to do. And that faithfulness, that decision means you're going to have to sacrifice something. It might cost you comfort, or a relationship, or time. But you're standing there in your resolve saying, come what may, by God's grace, I will still be here. Maybe that's you. And if that's how you would resonate with this story, I would encourage you to keep on pressing on. Keep God the focus of what you're doing and keep doing the tough things. But maybe right now for you, you resonate with Naomi. And you're asking yourself the question, why? Why is God against me when he is seemingly for everyone else? Why is this so hard? Did I do something to deserve this? I feel all alone. I have come back empty. Is that you? Now, here in the first chapter of Ruth, we aren't going to be able to put a nice shiny bow on this quite yet. There isn't much we're going to see in this chapter that's going to make everything better. But if you identify with Naomi's situation, and some of the heartache and the grief that she's experiencing, I want to try to point out just a couple of things. In other words, what would I tell Naomi if I had the chance to talk to her? A part of being in these situations as a friend or as a pastor, I have the opportunity to come alongside people when they're at their lowest, when they're experiencing this grief and heartache. Part of being in those situations is knowing what to say and when to say it and how to say it. I don't get that right every time, but if I could talk to Naomi and the time was right, here's what I would try to say to her. I would try to communicate this. Naomi, there's a couple of things I see in your story so far that aren't going to take away your pain, but maybe they're going to help you persevere and just keep going. And I would say, Naomi, there is an element of God's mercy at work in your story. I know you don't see it probably, and I don't blame you. What you've been through in those first 5 verses has been a level of tragedy that very few people can understand. But there has been mercy. And she might look at me and say, how can you say that? Where's the mercy? I would maybe try to point out just a couple of things that, Naomi, your family did survive the initial famine, and because that happened, that allowed your boys to meet 2 faithful, noble, and loving women who showed kindness to your sons and to you. And because they met and married those women, God moved in one of those women's heart for her to stay with you and to be a faithful companion to you at a time when you needed it the most, even though you don't see that, right? She says in verse 21, I have come back empty. But Ruth is right by your side. God put her there. And God brought you back home to a town full of people who were excited to see you. And I get it. You might not be able to see it now, but there will come a time when you'll be able to look back and see how God sustained you to keep going and gave you just a little bit of mercy to keep going that day and the next day after that and the next day after that. So I would try to communicate God's mercy to Naomi. But there's one more thing I would tell her. I want you to look at how this chapter ends. This is the last verse in chapter 1, verse 22. So Naomi came back from the territory of Moab with her daughter-in-law, Ruth the Moabitess. They arrived in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. See what happens in that verse? If I could talk to Naomi, I would tell her, Naomi, you have hope. You see, this verse lays out 2 very important things. One, as we've mentioned, she's not alone. Ruth, the Moabitess, the foreigner, is with her. That's going to be very important. But second, it's the beginning of harvest season. Yes, the famine is over, and now hope is dawning on the horizon. And while Naomi can't see it yet, this is going to set into motion a chain of events that's going to bring hope not only to Naomi and to Ruth, but to you and to me, to the entire world. So if you can relate to Naomi, I would tell you to hang in there. Don't give up. Don't quit. Look for the little ways that God has shown you his grace through his kindness, through his mercy, and through his hope. And that hope that comes from the cross of Jesus Christ, and how that cross of Jesus Christ is directly related to this story of Ruth. That's why we've called it the Gospel according to Ruth. You'll see what I mean as we finish this series up. Hang in there. I'm praying for you that God will remind you of his presence and his comfort and his mercy and his hope.